Chris had just turned 26 when he moved to a new city for a fresh start. He'd landed an entry-level tech job in a mid-sized company, and although the salary wasn't great, it was enough to scrape by barely. Like most people his age, trying to survive in expensive cities, Chris knew he couldn't afford a place on his own. After browsing through dozens of overpriced apartments and roommate ads, he finally came across a listing on Craigslist that seemed promising. The post was simple: room for rent in quiet neighborhood. $500 month, private bathroom, must be clean and responsible. The price was low, almost suspiciously low for the area, but Chris was desperate and running out of time before his temporary housing ended. He emailed the poster and got a reply within the hour. The guy's name was Darren. He sounded quiet but polite over the phone, one of those soft-spoken types who seem uncomfortable with conversation but try to be respectful. He told Chris that he worked nights as a janitor at a medical center, so he wasn't home much and preferred a roommate who kept to themselves. That actually sounded perfect to Chris, who worked long hours and valued his alone time. They agreed to meet the next evening. When Chris pulled up to the apartment, he was relieved to see a quiet, tree-lined street with modest buildings and parked cars that didn't have broken windows or parking tickets. The apartment was a plain two-bedroom on the second floor. Darren answered the door in a gray hoodie and jeans. He was pale, thin, maybe a little older than Chris, with thick glasses that slid down his nose every few seconds. His voice was just as soft in person, almost like he was trying not to bother anyone even in his own home. He gave Chris a quick tour. The place was clean. The living room had minimal furniture, the kitchen was neat, and the bathroom connected. To the second bedroom was private, just like the ad promised. There was no weird smell, no visible mess, no red flags. Chris asked why the rent was so cheap. Darren just shrugged and said, "I don't need much, just someone to help with the bills." Chris moved in that weekend. The first few days were uneventful. Darren mostly stayed in his room with the door closed. When they crossed paths in the kitchen or hallway, he offered a quick nod or a quiet, "Hey," then disappeared again. Chris didn't mind. It was peaceful. He worked all day, came home, ate, watched some Netflix, and went to bed. But on his third night, something strange happened. It was around 2:30 in the morning when Chris woke up to a faint creaking sound in the hallway footsteps, slow and deliberate. At first, he figured it was Darren coming home from work. But then, he remembered Darren said his shift ended around 6 a.m., and besides, the footsteps didn't sound like someone walking through the hall. They stopped right outside his door. Then there was a soft rustling sound like someone brushing against the wall or dragging a hand across the paint. Chris sat up, his heart pounding. The apartment was silent again. He waited, holding his breath, but eventually convinced himself it was just the building settling. He went back to sleep, though it took a while. The next morning he checked the hallway. Nothing was out of place. Darren's door was shut, and when Chris left for work, he noticed Darren's car was already gone. He had left before sunrise, meaning the footsteps couldn't have been him unless he had come home briefly in the middle of the night, walked silently to Chris's door, then left again. But why would he do that? It happened again 2 nights later. This time, Chris was wide awake when he heard it, the same slow, cautious footsteps in the hallway. They stopped in the exact same spot, right outside his door. He stared at the knob in the dark, waiting for it to turn. It didn't, but he could hear breathing, shallow, unsteady, almost like someone trying not to be heard. Chris sat frozen in his bed. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. After what felt like hours, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated down the hall. The apartment fell silent once more. The next day, Chris bought a wooden chair from a thrift store and started wedging it under his doorknob every night. He didn't want to admit he was scared, but something about Darren or the apartment was beginning to feel wrong. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the way Darren never really looked him in the eye, or how he always kept his door closed, even during the day. Chris had caught a glimpse inside once while walking past. No lights, just shadows and something that looked like a mattress on the floor. No posters, no personal stuff. Just empty walls. Most people would have asked questions or looked for another place, but Chris told himself he was being paranoid. The job was new, the city was unfamiliar, and maybe he was just stressed. That's what he kept saying to himself, night after night, as he listened to soft breathing on the other side of the door. Asterisk by the end of the first month, Chris was fully settled into the apartment, but the strange feeling in his gut hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. There was always this subtle tension hanging in the air, like the silence in the building wasn't natural. Every night, Chris would sit on his bed, listening carefully before going to sleep. The chair stayed wedged under his doorknob, just in case. The footsteps had become less frequent, but the uneasiness never left. Darren remained a quiet, distant presence in the apartment. They rarely spoke more than a few words a day, and Darren never invited conversation. His eyes were always slightly downcast, his voice barely louder than a whisper. One evening, Chris got home from work a little earlier than usual. The sun was still out, casting a soft golden light through the windows. As he walked up the stairs, he noticed that the apartment door was slightly ajar. That was unusual. Darren was obsessed with locking up. Chris pushed the door open and stepped inside, calling out, "Hey Darren, you home?" No answer. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. Then he saw it. Darren's bedroom door was shut tight, like always, but now a heavy-duty padlock had been installed on the outside. A thick steel latch had been drilled into the doorframe, with a rust-colored lock snapped into place. Chris stood there, confused. Why would someone lock their own bedroom from the outside? He stared at it for a long time, unease creeping into his chest. It didn't make sense. Was Darren keeping someone or something in there? Chris thought about calling someone. A friend, maybe. But he didn't have many people in the city yet, and the last thing he wanted was to seem paranoid or cause trouble if it turned out to be nothing. Still, it stayed in his mind all evening. Later, as they both stood in the kitchen, quietly making dinner, Chris decided to ask. He tried to keep it light. "Hey, I noticed the lock on your door. What's that about?" Darren barely glanced at him. "Just for privacy." Chris gave a forced laugh. "Privacy from who? Me?" There was a long pause. Darren didn't answer. He stirred something in a pot and walked back to his room, leaving Chris alone in the kitchen. That night, Chris lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling. He didn't want to imagine what could be in Darren's room, but his mind wouldn't let it go. 100 different scenarios played in his head. None of them were good. At around 3:15 a.m., he heard a new sound. Not footsteps this time, something softer. A tapping noise like long fingernails gently scratching the drywall. Tap, 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 then silence. Then tap, tap, tap again. It wasn't coming from his own walls. It was from the hallway. Chris sat up slowly, heart pounding. He stepped out of bed and moved toward his door. He pressed his ear against it. The tapping had stopped, but now he could hear something else, muffled whispering. At first, it sounded like gibberish. But the longer he listened, the more he began to realize it was a voice. A woman's voice. Fragile, broken, barely audible through the wall. He couldn't make out the words. It didn't sound angry. It sounded scared. Chris backed away from the door. Every hair on his body stood up. Who was she? There was no one else living there. No one had ever come by to visit Darren. Not once. The next morning, Chris tried to keep calm. He went through his usual routine: coffee, shower, drive to work, but his mind wouldn't shut off. He considered reporting it anonymously to the landlord, maybe asking if anyone else had ever complained about strange noises in the building. But what would he even say? That his roommate might be locking someone in his bedroom? It sounded insane. Even to him. The following night, he left his door slightly cracked, just enough to see a sliver of the hallway from his bed. He stayed up late with the lights off, watching, and around 2:47 a.m., he saw something. A shadow moved past the hallway wall, just a quick flash of movement. It stopped in front of Darren's door. Chris held his breath. The shadow stood there, motionless. He could barely make it out in the dim light from the kitchen nightlight, but it wasn't Darren. This figure was smaller, thinner. The shadow crouched, almost like it was sitting on the floor. Then he heard the whispering again, softer than before, but definitely coming from that spot. The shadow didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. Then, just as silently as it had arrived, it slid back down the hallway and out of sight. Chris didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By now, the fear had moved past unease. Something was wrong in the apartment. Darren wasn't just weird, he was hiding something. Chris knew he needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He thought about trying to open Darren's door while he was away. Maybe just a quick look, something to either prove he was overreacting or confirm his worst fears. The idea sat heavy in his chest. He didn't want to be right, but deep down, he already knew this wasn't just a bad roommate situation. This was something else, something dark. And if he didn't figure it out soon, he might not get the chance. It was late Friday afternoon. When Darren mentioned, offhandedly, that he'd be out of town for the weekend. He didn't offer details, just said he was visiting his uncle upstate and would be back Sunday night. Chris tried not to look too relieved, but inside, his chest lightened for the first time in weeks. The apartment had started to feel like a cage, and Darren's presence, always looming and unreadable, made it worse. Chris had been losing sleep, checking his locks twice, even glancing behind shower curtains every morning. Now finally, he'd have the place to himself, and more importantly, he'd have a chance to look inside Darren's room. He waited until midnight. He wanted to be sure Darren was gone and not coming back for anything. Chris watched from the living room window as Darren's car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. He sat in silence for over an hour, staring at the locked bedroom door, trying to decide if this was a stupid idea. But the image of the padlock, the whispering, the shadowy figure crouched by the door, it all played through his mind like a tape on loop. He had to know. When he finally stood and walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaked beneath him. Darren's door was shut as usual, but the padlock was missing. Whether Darren had taken it off before leaving or never used it when he wasn't home, Chris didn't know. His hand hovered above the doorknob for a long time before he finally twisted it and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. It wasn't strong enough to knock him back, but it was distinct bleach mixed with something sour, something rotting. He stepped inside and flicked on the light. The bulb overhead flickered to life, casting a yellowish glow over the room. It was almost empty. No posters, no photos, not even curtains. Just a thin mattress on the floor, a folding chair, and a small wooden desk with nothing on it but a notebook, closed tightly with a rubber band. The room was so bare, so void of any sign of real life, it didn't feel lived in at all. It felt more like a space used for something else, something deliberate. Then Chris saw a dot in the center of the floor. Partly hidden under the corner of a rug was a small trapdoor. He walked over slowly, heart hammering in his chest. The rug slid aside easily, revealing a square wooden hatch with a steel ring embedded in the center. It was old and splintered, with scratch marks around the edges as if someone had tried to pry it. Opened from underneath. Chris dropped to one knee and took a breath. Then, with trembling hands, he gripped the metal ring and pulled. The hatch lifted with a low creak, revealing a shallow hole beneath the floorboards. His phone flashlight cut through the darkness. It wasn't deep, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but it was what lay inside that made his stomach drop. Clothes. A pile of them, old and dirty, some torn. He saw a floral blouse with bloodstains on it, a pair of jeans with one leg shredded, and near the bottom, partly buried under a gray hoodie, was a white canvas shoe, a woman's shoe. The toe was stained dark red. Chris couldn't move. He stared down into the hole, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a closet. It wasn't storage. It was something else. Something wrong. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, a whisper, soft and trembling. Chris spun around. No. One was there, but it hadn't come from the hallway. It came from underneath the floor. He turned back toward the hole, lowering the light again. The clothes didn't move. Nothing stirred. But the whisper came again, faint, barely audible, like wind through a crack in the wall. It was a voice. A woman's voice. It didn't say words, not clearly, but there was a tone to it. Pain. Desperation. Like someone trying to call out after being silent for too long. Chris slammed the hatch shut, nearly dropping his phone. He stumbled back, tripping over the rug. Breathing hard, heart racing. He didn't know what he had just seen or heard, but he knew he couldn't stay. He backed out of the room, slammed the door shut, and practically ran to his bedroom. Within 20 minutes, he had shoved all his essentials into a backpack and left the apartment without looking back. He didn't know where he was going, just that he wasn't staying another night in that place. He found a motel off the highway and sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, shaking. He couldn't shake the image of that trapdoor, the bloody clothes, the shoe, the whisper. Someone had been in that room. Maybe still was. That night, he called the police anonymously from a gas station payphone using a made-up name. He told them what he'd seen, described the apartment, and warned them to check beneath the floor. Chris didn't return. He didn't even wait to hear what they found. He just hoped they were fast enough. Chris never went back to the apartment after that night. He crashed at a friend's place for a while, someone he barely knew from work, just to have somewhere safe to sleep. He didn't tell them much, just said he'd had a bad experience with a roommate and needed some space. His friend didn't ask too many questions, which suited him just fine. Still, Chris kept checking the local news for the next few days, expecting a report about a police investigation, an arrest, or at the very least, something about human remains being discovered in an apartment. But there was nothing. No headlines. No breaking story, no updates at all. He started to wonder if the cops had even followed up on the anonymous tip. Maybe they thought it was a prank call. Maybe Darren had gotten rid of whatever was down there before they showed up. Or worse, maybe, there was never enough proof for them to do anything about it. The idea that Darren could have gone right back to living in that apartment after everything Chris saw made his skin crawl. About a week later, Chris got a call from an unknown number. He didn't answer it. Then he got a voicemail. It was short. Just 10 seconds of silence, except, in the background, if you turned the volume up, you could hear something. Breathing. Slow, shaky, and very close to the microphone. Then, right before it cut off, came a whisper so faint he had to replay it over and over to catch it. "Why'd you leave?" Chris deleted the voicemail without listening again. He changed his number the next day. Weeks passed. He started therapy, tried to focus on work, and slowly rebuilt his routine. He told himself it was over, that he was safe. But every night before bed, he still checked the locks. He kept a chair pressed under the doorknob, just in case. Some habits die hard. It wasn't until nearly a month later that he saw Darren again by accident. Chris was walking home from a corner store, a bag of groceries in hand, when he spotted a familiar shape across the street. Darren, standing under a streetlight, half in shadow, his hoodie pulled up, staring directly at him. Chris froze mid-step. Darren didn't wave, didn't speak. He just smiled, then turned and walked away. Chris hurried home, dropped the groceries, and locked every door and window. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He filed a report with the police the next day, told them about the trapdoor, the clothes, everything he had seen. This time, he gave his real name. The officer listened, nodded, and took some notes, but Chris could tell by the tone of his voice that he didn't expect much to come of it. There was no search warrant, no follow-up. And eventually, Chris gave up trying to get answers. He moved to a different part of the city a few weeks later. New apartment, new locks, new number. He thought he could finally let it go. But the nightmares never stopped. They always started the same way. He'd be lying in bed, awake but unable to move. He'd hear the soft tapping sound on the wall, then the breathing, and then the trapdoor creaking open. In the dream, something would crawl out. Something with long fingers, pale skin, and wide, empty eyes. It never spoke, but it always knew his name. One morning, after another sleepless night, Chris decided to do something that both terrified and obsessed him. He went back online and searched Craigslist listings. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Maybe confirmation, maybe closure. But there it was, a familiar post. Room for rent in quiet neighborhood. $500 per month. Private bathroom. Must be clean and responsible. Same wording. Same layout. Same price. But a different contact name. Chris clicked the listing. The photo showed a new bedspread. A different chair in the living room, but it was the same apartment. He was sure of it. The windows, the kitchen tiles, even the scratch-in. The hallway floor near the door frame. The same. He didn't message the poster. He didn't even screenshot the page. He just closed his laptop, stood up, and walked into the bathroom to throw up. Someone else was going to move in. Someone else was going to hear the whispers. Someone else might not make it out. A week later, Chris received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just his name, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No message, just a drawing. It was crude, like something done with a dull pencil. A rectangle representing a floor. A hatch in the middle. And underneath it, two small figures, one standing, one lying down, and scribbled underneath it, in faint block letters, "You opened it. Now you're part of it." Chris burned the letter without telling anyone. He moved again after that. Changed jobs. Went completely off the grid. And even now, years later, he still wonders what he really saw that night. Not just beneath the floorboards, but in Darren's eyes, in the silence of that apartment. He doesn't tell the story often, but when he does, he ends it the same way every time. Be careful who you live with. Some people don't want a roommate. They want a witness.